You don't own this land, and you never will. Actually, I own every inch your house sits on, and I have the deed to prove it. The woman's face turned crimson as reality began to sink in. Hi, I'm Rebecca Torres, and this is the story of how I inherited 1,500 acres, discovered a corrupt HOA president had been terrorizing my community for over a decade, and brought her entire empire crashing down. I never imagined Aunt Patricia would leave me anything. We'd cross paths maybe 4 times my entire life. Always at family reunions where she'd sit alone with her wine, passionately discussing conservation like it was scripture. She was my mother's eldest sister, the one who never married, never had children, and never seemed to care what anyone thought of her choices. When the attorney phoned saying she'd passed and left me 1,500 acres in Greenfield, I assumed it was a mistake. I was living in a cramped studio 3 hours away, working as an environmental consultant, barely saving enough to consider a condo down payment. The notion that I suddenly owned more land than entire towns seemed absurd, like winning a lottery I never entered. But the deed was legitimate. The paperwork was real. Within days, I was driving down winding country roads toward property I'd never seen, trying to comprehend how my life had just transformed in ways I couldn't begin to understand. The law office smelled of aged paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of establishment that probably looked identical for 4 decades. The attorney, a slender man in his 60s named Harrison, slid a manila folder across his desk with an expression mixing sympathy and curiosity. Inside were documents that made my head spin, property deeds from 1885, tax records, surveys, and a lease agreement from 1956 mentioning something called the Pine Grove Development Company. Harrison explained that Patricia's grandfather had signed a 99-year lease permitting a developer to build on 750 acres with strict conditions about residential use, environmental protection, and respect for existing residents. The lease would expire in 2055. But one clause caught my attention, terminable upon 60 days' notice for breach of contract. I asked what that meant, and Harrison simply smiled, saying I should probably visit the property before making decisions. The way he said it suggested he knew something I didn't, and whatever it was wouldn't be simple. The drive to Greenfield took me through rolling hills painted in autumn colors, scenery belonging on postcards. When I finally turned onto the private road leading to Patricia's land, something shifted in my chest. A strange mixture of excitement and responsibility. The property was beautiful in ways that made me understand why Patricia had fought so hard to protect it. Dense forest opened into meadows. A crystal stream cut through the valley, and distant gentle hills rose against perfect blue sky. But as I drove deeper, I started noticing things that didn't fit. Metal fences looked too new, too industrial for the natural landscape. Paved driveways appeared where dirt roads should have been. Then I saw the sign, Private Property, Pine Grove HOA, No Trespassing, planted right in the middle of what the deed said was my land, bold and unwelcome as a slap in the face. I parked near what appeared to be the residential development's edge and got out to walk around. The houses were nice, well maintained. The suburban dream magazines love photographing. But something felt wrong about the entire setup. Like someone had taken wilderness and forced it into a box it was never meant to fit. I was standing there examining a survey stake I'd placed when an elderly couple approached from across the road. The man was probably mid-70s, lean and weathered. The woman had kind eyes that looked worried. They introduced themselves as Gerald and Martha. After brief conversation about who I was and why I was there, Gerald leaned close and said something that chilled my blood. be careful with the HOA. They don't like outsiders, and they don't play fair. Martha nodded and mentioned a woman named Evelyn Carter, an 82-year-old widow who'd been fined $48,000 for violating aesthetic guidelines. When I asked what that meant, Gerald just shook his head and said I should talk to Evelyn myself if I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. They gave me directions to her house and walked away quickly, like they feared being seen talking to me. Evelyn Carter's house was small but immaculate, with a garden showing decades of careful attention. She answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane, and when I explained who I was, her face cycled through emotions I couldn't read. She invited me inside and within minutes had spread a stack of letters across her kitchen table, each stamped with the Pine Grove HOA logo. The fines were insane. $300 for grass, 3 inches over regulation height, $500 for a mailbox, the wrong shade of beige, $2,000 for planting lilies instead of approved shrubs. The letters went back years, totaling just over $48,000. Evelyn's hands trembled as she told her story. She'd built this house 42 years ago, long before the HOA existed, on land she thought was hers. Now, they threatened to place a lien on her property and force a sale if she didn't pay. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. This is my home. I raised my babies here. I buried my husband from here. Now they're trying to take it because my grass was too tall. I promised I'd investigate, though I had no idea what I could actually do. All I knew was that something about this situation was deeply, fundamentally wrong. My next encounter came less than an hour later, far less friendly. I was walking back to my car when a white Lexus pulled up fast, stopping inches from where I stood. The woman who emerged was probably mid-40s, dressed like she was heading to a country club, with an expression saying she was used to getting her way. She walked straight to me and demanded to know what I was doing on her community's property. I stayed calm and explained I was Rebecca Torres, the new owner, conducting a survey. Her face went crimson. She informed me in a voice that could cut glass that her name was Victoria Blackwell, that she was president of the Pine Grove Homeowners Association, and that I was trespassing on private community land. I pulled out my deed and showed her the property boundaries. She barely glanced before telling me the document was obviously wrong, that the HOA had occupied this land for decades, and that I needed to remove my survey stakes immediately. I told her the stakes were staying, that I had every legal right to be there. She stepped closer, close enough that I could see anger pulsing in her jaw, and said, "We'll see about that." Then she got back in her Lexus and drove off, leaving me with the distinct feeling I'd just made a very powerful enemy. That night, I sat in Patricia's old cabin, reviewing the inheritance documents with fresh eyes. The property maps were clear, 1,500 acres purchased in 1885, with a 750-acre section leased to Pine Grove Development Company in 1956. The lease terms were specific, residential use only. No commercial activity. Maintain green spaces. Respect original residents' rights. I pulled out a calculator and did the math. The lease was for 99 years, expiring in 2055. But that termination clause kept nagging at me, terminable upon 60 days' notice for breach of contract. I started listing everything I'd seen that day. The community center Gerald mentioned, the one they rented for weddings and corporate events. The management company charging monthly fees. The systematic harassment of Evelyn Carter, who'd been here longer than the HOA existed. Every single one could potentially be considered a breach. I sat back and looked at documents spread across the table. For the first time since inheriting this land, I smiled. Victoria Blackwell thought she was in charge, She thought this was her community, her domain, her kingdom. She had absolutely no idea that she and everyone in that HOA were living on my land under a contract they'd been violating for years. She had no idea what was coming, but I was going to make sure she found out. The Greenfield Public Library was one of those small-town institutions that felt frozen in time. All dark wood and hushed voices and the smell of old books mixed with fresh coffee from the reading room. I spent the entire next morning in the local history section, pulling everything about Patricia, the land, and Pine Grove's development. What I discovered painted a picture I hadn't expected. Patricia hadn't just been a nature lover or casual environmentalist. She'd been a fighter. Someone who'd gone to war with developers, county commissioners, and anyone threatening the land her family had protected for generations. Newspaper clippings from the 70s and 80s showed her at protests, town hall meetings, court hearings. One article from 1999 caught my attention. Local landowner opposes HOA expansion. Patricia had apparently fought tooth and nail to prevent Pine Grove from extending beyond original lease boundaries. According to the article, she'd won. The reporter quoted her, "This land doesn't belong to corporations or control freaks. It belongs to the community." And that means everyone, not just people who can afford to follow arbitrary rules. The more I read, the more I understood Patricia's fight hadn't ended with that victory. She'd spent years monitoring the HOA, filing complaints when they overstepped, advocating for residents who couldn't afford lawyers. She'd been particularly vocal about protecting what she called legacy residents. People like Evelyn, who'd built homes before the HOA existed and suddenly found themselves subject to rules they'd never agreed to. The last article I found was from 6 years ago. A letter to the editor, Patricia had written warning that the HOA was becoming increasingly aggressive and commercial in operations. She'd specifically mentioned creation of a management company and questioned its legality under original lease terms. Reading her words, I felt something click into place. Patricia hadn't just left me land. She'd left me an unfinished battle. Somehow, I knew she'd expected me to pick up where she'd left off. The question was whether I had the courage and resources to actually do it. My next stop was the office of Benjamin Walsh, a semi-retired lawyer who'd practiced in Greenfield for over 40 years. Harrison had mentioned his name, said he'd worked with Patricia on various land issues over the years. Benjamin's office was above a bakery on Main Street, and when I walked in, I found him surrounded by filing cabinets and stacks of legal books that looked like they predated the internet. He was a large man with white hair and sharp eyes, and when I told him who I was, his whole face lit up. He said Patricia had been one of his favorite clients, not because she paid well, but because she actually cared about doing things right. We talked for over 2 hours, and what he told me confirmed my worst suspicions about the HOA. According to Benjamin, Pine Grove HOA had been relatively benign when it formed in 1976. It was meant to maintain common areas and handle basic community needs. But everything changed in 2011 when Victoria Blackwell became president. Benjamin pulled out a file he'd apparently been keeping for years, and the pattern was stunning in its cruelty. Under Victoria's leadership, the HOA had issued over $215,000 in fines to 51 different families in just 6 years. The violations were often absurd. Grass height measured with rulers, paint colors compared to chips that were decades old, Christmas decorations deemed excessive, children's toys left visible in yards. Benjamin showed me case after case of families driven to financial ruin trying to fight or pay these fines. Some had been forced to sell their homes. Others had declared bankruptcy. A few had simply given up and moved away, abandoning property they'd spent decades paying for. The worst part was that Victoria seemed to target the most vulnerable residents, the elderly. Single parents, families who didn't speak English as their first language. Benjamin leaned back in his chair. Patricia suspected Victoria was making money off this somehow, but she died before she could prove it. If you're planning to look into this, Rebecca, you need to understand what you're up against. Victoria doesn't just want control, she needs it, and she'll destroy anyone who threatens her power. Before I left, Benjamin gave me the name of a real estate attorney in the city, someone named Marcus Chen, who specialized in property disputes and land use law. He said if I was serious about challenging the HOA, I'd need someone with his expertise. I called Marcus from my car, and to my surprise, he agreed to meet that same afternoon. His office was sleek and modern, all glass and steel, the complete opposite of Benjamin's cramped space above the bakery. Marcus himself was probably late 30s, dressed in a sharp suit with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. I laid out everything I knew, the lease terms, the violations I'd observed, Evelyn's situation, the pattern of fines, Victoria's aggressive behavior. Marcus listened without interrupting, taking notes on a tablet, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled up the lease agreement on his computer and started reading with the kind of focus that made me realize I'd found the right person. After 20 minutes, Marcus looked up and smiled. And it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who just spotted weakness in their opponent's armor. He explained that 99-year leases were unusual but legally binding, and that the breach clauses in this particular lease were very specific. Commercial activity meant any business operation conducted on leased land for profit. Harassment of original residents was self-explanatory. Environmental damage would require documentation, but wasn't hard to prove given the construction that had happened. Then he pulled up the state business registry and showed me something that made my heart race. Pine Grove Management, LLC had been incorporated in 2013, 2 years after Victoria became HOA president. The company listed its primary business as property management and community services, and it charged every HOA member $500 per month in management fees on top of regular HOA dues. Marcus looked at me. That's commercial activity. Rebecca, that's a direct breach of lease terms. And if Victoria is personally profiting from this company, which I'd bet money she is, then you have grounds to terminate the lease and potentially sue for damages. He paused, then added, but you need to understand what this means. If you terminate the lease, 27 families lose the legal right to occupy your land. You could evict them. That's serious, and it's going to make you very unpopular. I sat there processing what he'd said, thinking about Evelyn and Gerald and Martha and all the other people who'd built their lives on this land. They weren't the problem. They were victims, just like Evelyn, trapped in a system Victoria had corrupted for her own benefit. I looked at Marcus. I don't want to hurt innocent people. I want to stop Victoria and help the residents who've been abused by her regime. Marcus nodded slowly. Then we need a strategy. First, we document everything. Every violation. Every fine. Every instance of harassment. We get sworn statements from victims. We get financial records from the management company. We build a case so airtight that when we move, Victoria can't wiggle out of it. Second, we use the threat of lease termination as leverage, but we make clear you're only targeting the HOA structure and the people who've corrupted it, not the residents themselves. Third, we do this in public. We make sure everyone knows exactly what Victoria has been doing and why she's being held accountable. I left his office with a plan and purpose. Patricia had spent her life protecting this land and the people on it. Now it was my turn, and I wasn't going to let her down. The survey team arrived on a Tuesday morning. 3 professionals with GPS equipment that looked like it belonged on a space mission. I'd hired them through Marcus's recommendation, and their job was simple: establish the exact boundaries of my 1,500 acres and document every structure, fence, and improvement built on the property. The lead surveyor, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, told me it would take 3 days to complete a comprehensive survey of this size. I told her to take whatever time she needed and to document everything. I wanted photographs, measurements, coordinates, the works. If we were going to do this, we were going to do it right. The team set up equipment near the edge of what I now thought of as HOA territory, and within an hour, they'd placed the first series of bright orange stakes marking the property line. That's when Victoria showed up. She came roaring up in her Lexus like she was leading a cavalry charge, and I could see fury on her face before she even got out. She marched straight toward me, ignoring the survey crew entirely, and demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I kept my voice calm and told her I was conducting a legal survey of my property, which was my right as landowner. She said I was harassing the community, that I was trespassing on HOA land, and that she was calling the police immediately. I told her to go ahead, that I'd be happy to show the police my deed and survey permits. She pulled out her phone and made the call right there, speaking in that tight, controlled voice people use when trying to sound reasonable while being completely unreasonable. The officer who responded was young, probably not long out of the academy, and he looked uncomfortable from the moment he arrived. Victoria immediately launched into a speech about property rights and community protection, but when the officer asked to see documentation, I was ready. I showed him my deed, the survey permits, and the lease agreement. He read through everything carefully, then turned to Victoria and told her I had every legal right to survey my property. The look on her face was priceless, a mixture of shock and rage that she couldn't quite hide behind her practiced smile. The survey results came back 3 days later, and they were even better than I'd hoped. The report was over 100 pages long, complete with detailed maps, photographs, and GPS coordinates. The HOA Community Center, which they rented out for weddings and corporate events at $2,000 per day, sat entirely on my land. The new parking lot they'd constructed 2 years ago without anyone's permission was also on my property. Most significantly, 27 of the 33 houses in the HOA development were located on the leased portion of my land. With 6 others sitting on property the HOA had never had any legal right to occupy. The survey also documented extensive environmental damage, wetlands that had been filled in, old-growth trees that had been clear-cut, and a stream that had been redirected to make room for a tennis court. Every single one of these items represented a potential breach of the lease agreement. I sat in Patricia's cabin that night with the survey report spread out on the table, staring at the numbers. 27 families. If I terminated the lease, I could lease this land to a developer myself. Marcus had mentioned the market value earlier that day, $16 million. That was generational wealth. That was never worrying about money again. For about 30 seconds, I let myself imagine it. A house overlooking the ocean. Travel. Freedom from the constant stress of consultant work. Then I thought about Evelyn's face, her trembling hands holding those letters, and I felt sick to my stomach. Patricia didn't fight her whole life so I could become exactly what she fought against. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. This was about justice for Evelyn and all the other people who'd been crushed under Victoria's regime. I spent the next week building what Marcus called a war room. I converted Patricia's dining room into a command center, covering the walls with maps, timelines, and documentation. I requested copies of HOA meeting minutes through a Freedom of Information Act request, and what I found in those minutes was damning. There were records of fines being levied for violations that weren't in official HOA rules. There were discussions about problem residents who needed to be encouraged to relocate. There were budget items for the management company that showed monthly payments going to an entity Victoria controlled. I also requested financial records for Pine Grove Management LLC through the State Business Registry. And when they arrived, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The company had collected over $1.9 million in management fees over 6 years. According to tax filings, Victoria had paid herself $425,000 in compensation during that same period. She wasn't just running the HOA like a dictator. She was using it as a personal ATM. The next phase was gathering testimony from the victims. And this was where the human cost of Victoria's corruption really hit home. I organized a quiet meeting at Evelyn's house, keeping it small and informal so people wouldn't feel intimidated. 14 families showed up, and every single one had a story that made my blood boil. There was a family who'd been fined $32,000 for installing solar panels the HOA claimed were aesthetically displeasing. Even though the panels were on the back of their roof and barely visible from the street, there was a young couple who'd been banned from keeping backyard chickens for their children's education project and fined $16,000 when they initially refused to get rid of the birds. There was an elderly man who'd been cited for having a garden shed 6 inches too tall, according to HOA regulations that had been changed after he built it. The pattern was clear. Victoria targeted anyone who showed independence or questioned her authority, and she used the fine system to punish dissent and fund her lifestyle. Evelyn broke down crying as she listened to the other stories, saying she thought she was alone, that she'd been too ashamed to tell anyone what was happening to her. I promised everyone in that room that they weren't alone anymore and that I was going to do everything in my power to stop Victoria and make things right. The final piece of preparation was working out the legal strategy with Marcus. And this was where things got complicated. He explained that I had several options, each with different implications. I could issue a 60-day notice of breach and give the HOA a chance to cure the violations, which was the most conservative approach, but also least likely to result in real change. I could immediately file for lease termination and eviction, which would be legally justified, but would also hurt innocent residents and make me look like the villain. Or I could do what Marcus called the public pressure campaign, document everything, issue the breach notice, and use the 60-day cure period to build community support and expose Victoria's corruption. If the HOA failed to cure the breaches, which Marcus thought was almost certain given how deeply embedded the problems were, I could then terminate the lease with full community support behind me. The key was transparency. I needed to make clear I wasn't attacking the residents or trying to steal anyone's home. I was attacking a corrupt system that had been hurting those residents for years. I delivered the breach notice myself, and I did it at the monthly HOA meeting where I knew there would be witnesses. The community center was packed that evening. At least 65 people crammed into a room designed for 45, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victoria sat at the head table with her board members, all of them looking smug and self-assured, like they were royalty holding court. When I walked in, conversation stopped. People turned to stare. Victoria's eyes narrowed, but she kept that fake smile plastered on her face as she asked if I was lost. I walked straight to the front of the room, pulled out the breach notice, and handed it to her directly. I said loudly enough for everyone to hear that I was formally notifying the Pine Grove HOA of multiple breaches of their lease agreement and that they had 60 days to cure those breaches or face termination of the lease. The room went dead silent. Victoria looked at the document like I'd just handed her a snake. And when she finally spoke, her voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. She said this was absurd, that the HOA owned this land, that I was clearly confused about how property rights worked. I didn't argue with her. I simply pulled out my laptop and asked if I could use the projector. What happened next was something I'd rehearsed with Marcus a dozen times, but actually doing it in front of a hostile crowd was something else entirely. I pulled up the survey map and displayed it on the wall behind Victoria's head, showing the original 1,500-acre property boundaries in bright red. Then I overlaid the current HOA development, and you could actually hear people gasp when they saw how much of the community sat on leased land. I walked through the lease terms slowly and clearly. No commercial activity. Respect for original residents. Environmental protection. Then I showed them the evidence of violations. Photographs of the community center with a banner advertising wedding rentals. Financial records showing the management company's fees. Documentation of fines levied against Evelyn and others. The timeline of environmental damage. By the time I finished, half the room was staring at Victoria with expressions ranging from confusion to outright anger. She stood up so fast her chair tipped backward, and she said I was lying, that I'd fabricated these documents, that this was some elaborate scam. I offered to let anyone examine the originals. No one took me up on it, but several people pulled out their phones and started taking pictures of the projection screen. Victoria's voice rose as she told them to stop, that this was private HOA business. But it was too late. The information was out there, and there was no taking it back. Within 48 hours, the retaliation started. The HOA held an emergency meeting without notifying me, and they voted to levy immediate fines against me for what they called unauthorized survey activity and disruption of community peace. The total came to $105,000, and they placed a lien on my property the same day. Then Victoria organized what she called a community phone tree, which was really just a systematic harassment campaign. I started getting calls at all hours, dozens of them, from numbers I didn't recognize. Some were just hang-ups. Others were angry residents who'd been told I was trying to steal their homes. A few were outright threatening. I documented every single call, saved every voicemail, and forwarded the information to both Marcus and the police. But the worst part wasn't the calls. It was watching the social media campaign unfold in real time. The HOA's online pages suddenly exploded with posts about me, calling me a greedy outsider, a property developer trying to destroy a peaceful community, a con artist who'd somehow tricked her way into a fraudulent deed. There were posts urging residents to protect our homes and stand against corporate greed, with my name and face plastered everywhere. Within a week, I'd become the most hated person in Greenfield, and I hadn't even done anything except tell the truth. Part of me wanted to give up. Part of me wanted to evict everyone and let them figure it out themselves. Why should I risk everything for people who half of them thought I was the villain? Marcus talked me down that night. He reminded me that fear makes people irrational, and that I couldn't punish the innocent for Victoria's manipulation. The fence incident happened on a Friday afternoon. I drove out to check on some survey markers near the northern property line and found a brand new chain-link fence cutting straight across my land. It was professionally installed with concrete footings and posts that looked like they'd been meant to last forever. The fence blocked access to a fire road that ran through my property, and it was clearly designed to keep me out of an area the HOA had decided was theirs. I called Marcus immediately, and he told me I had every legal right to remove the fence since it was on my property without my permission. I called a local contractor who brought out a truck and cutting tools, and we started dismantling the fence section by section. We'd been working maybe 20 minutes when Victoria showed up with 7 board members trailing behind her like an angry mob. She was screaming before she even got out of her vehicle, telling me I was destroying HOA property, that she was calling the police, that I was going to jail for vandalism. I stayed calm and explained that the fence was on my property, installed without my permission, and that I was exercising my legal right to remove it. She got right up in my face, close enough that I could smell her perfume, and told me that if I touched one more section of that fence, she'd have me arrested for trespassing and assault. The contractor looked at me nervously, clearly not wanting to be part of whatever was about to happen, but I told him to keep working. Victoria started shouting orders to her board members, telling them to physically block us from the fence. And for a moment, I thought things were going to turn violent. That's when the police arrived. 2 officers this time. And they did not look happy about being called out for another property dispute. Victoria immediately launched into her victim speech, talking about how I was harassing the community, destroying property, threatening residents. One of the officers held up his hand to stop her and asked me for my side of the story. I showed him the survey map, the property deed, and photographs proving the fence had been installed on my land within the last 48 hours. The officer studied the documents for what felt like forever, then turned to Victoria and told her the fence was illegally placed and needed to be removed immediately. She lost it. She started screaming about corruption, about how the police were obviously being paid off, about how this was a conspiracy to destroy her community. The officer warned her once to calm down, and when she kept screaming, he warned her again. Finally, he told her that if she didn't leave immediately, he was going to arrest her for disturbing the peace. The look on her face was something I'll never forget. A mixture of shock and humiliation and pure hatred. She got back in her Lexus and peeled out, leaving her board members standing there looking confused and embarrassed. 2 weeks after the fence incident, I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning to the smell of smoke. For a few seconds, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard the crackle of flames, and my brain snapped into full alert. I grabbed my phone and ran outside, and what I saw made my heart stop. There was a fire burning near the side of Patricia's cabin, right next to where the gas line connected to the house. It was small but growing fast, and I could see the grass starting to catch. I called 911 and then grabbed the garden hose, spraying water on the flames while trying not to panic. The fire department arrived within 10 minutes, which probably saved my life and definitely saved the cabin. They put out the fire quickly and then started investigating. And within an hour, they'd confirmed what I already suspected. This was arson. Someone had poured gasoline in a line leading from the woods to the gas connection and lit it with clear intention of causing an explosion. If I'd been sleeping more soundly, if the wind had been blowing differently, if the fire had reached the gas line 30 seconds earlier, I would have died. The fire marshal took my statement and said they'd investigate. But he also said that without witnesses or evidence, it was going to be hard to prove who was responsible. The fire marshal couldn't prove Victoria ordered it, but her rhetoric had created an environment where someone felt justified trying to kill me. I called Marcus from the hospital where they'd taken me to check for smoke inhalation, and I told him we needed to accelerate our timeline. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. This was about survival, and I wasn't going to wait around for whoever did this to try again. The morning after the fire, I met with Marcus in his office, and we made the decision to go nuclear. He filed an emergency motion for an injunction to stop all HOA collection activities, arguing that the organization was engaging in systematic harassment and potentially criminal intimidation. He also filed a comprehensive civil suit naming the HOA, its board members, and specifically Victoria for breach of contract, trespassing, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy to defraud. The damages we requested were $2.8 million, broken down into back rent for 50 years of unauthorized use, compensatory damages for the victims, punitive damages for the malicious conduct, and attorney's fees. Within hours of filing, the local newspaper picked up the story. And suddenly, what had been a private property dispute became front-page news. The headline read, 1,500-acre land dispute reveals HOA corruption, and the article laid out the basic facts in a way that made Victoria look exactly as bad as she deserved. My phone started ringing with calls from other media outlets, and Marcus advised me to do a carefully controlled press conference. I held it on my property, standing in a meadow with the forest behind me. I explained that I had no interest in evicting families or destroying the community, but that I also wouldn't tolerate corruption and abuse. I announced that I was dedicating 550 acres of the property to create a public park with walking trails, community gardens, and recreational areas. Anyone would be welcome to use it. No fees. No fines. No rules except basic respect for the land and each other. I said that this was what Patricia had always wanted, land that served the community instead of controlling it. Space that brought people together instead of driving them apart. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 days, over 120 people had contacted me asking for more information, and several families publicly announced they were withdrawing from the HOA entirely and would rather deal with me directly as their landlord. I organized a simple community picnic in the meadow. 160 people showed up, including roughly 65% of the HOA residents, and the atmosphere was completely different from the tents. Controlled meetings Victoria had always run. Kids were running around playing. Families were actually talking to each other instead of worrying about being reported for violations. The turning point came when Evelyn stood up and asked if she could say something. I handed her a portable microphone, and she spoke in a voice that shook but never wavered. She told her story in front of everyone, describing the years of fines and threats, the fear of losing her home, the shame of feeling like she'd done something wrong when all she'd done was live her life. By the time she finished, there were tears running down her face, and she said something that made half the crowd start crying too. For 11 years, I was afraid every single day. Today, standing here on this land with all of you, I'm free. The applause was thunderous, and I watched as 9 families approached me afterward to say they were done with the HOA and wanted to know how to terminate their membership immediately. We formed a group we called Residents for Fair Community, and within a week, we'd collected signatures from 46 residents calling for a special election to remove Victoria as president. It wasn't enough to force the election under HOA bylaws, but it was enough to show that her support was crumbling. The cracks in her empire were showing, and everyone could see it. The call from Marcus came on a Wednesday afternoon, and the news was better than I dared to hope. The judge had granted our injunction, which meant the HOA was prohibited from collecting any fines or fees until the trial was resolved. All existing liens were frozen, and the HOA was barred from taking any adverse action against residents who were behind on payments. But the real bombshell was what came next. The judge had ordered a public hearing where the HOA would have to produce all financial records, meeting minutes, and communications. He wasn't just going to review the evidence in chambers. He was going to make everything visible to the entire community in an open forum. Then Marcus called me back an hour later, and his voice had changed. Victoria's legal team had found something, a clause in the lease agreement about improvements made in good faith. They were arguing that 40 years of continuous occupation and infrastructure investment gave the HOA an equity claim that superseded the breach provisions. It was a long shot, but it was a legal theory that had worked in a handful of cases across the country. The judge had scheduled a supplementary hearing to examine the argument, and Marcus sounded worried for the first time since we'd started working together. For 2 weeks, I thought everything would collapse. The judge would find some technicality, some loophole, and Victoria would walk away laughing while Evelyn and the others suffered for another decade. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Marcus and I spent every day digging through case law, looking for precedents that would shut down Victoria's defense. Then we found it. Not in case law, but in Victoria's own emails. Marcus had subpoenaed her personal email account as part of discovery, and buried in thousands of messages was a thread from 7 months ago between Victoria and a real estate developer. The subject line read, "Long-term land acquisition strategy." The email laid out her entire plan in clinical, professional language, exploring long-term options for land acquisition, utilizing continuous occupation doctrine. Legal counsel suggests strong position after 45 years of improvements and property investment. Preliminary market analysis estimates land value at $16 million for the 750-acre parcel. Standard finder's fee structure would be 12% of transaction value. Current owner's heir resides out of state and appears to have limited knowledge of property law complexities. Timeline suggests optimal window for negotiation within next 18 to 24 months. She hadn't been operating in good faith at all. She'd been planning to steal my land and sell it for millions while pretending to protect the community. Marcus called Victoria's attorney and told him we had the email. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then the attorney said he needed to consult with his client. 2 days later, Victoria withdrew her good faith defense entirely. The hearing was scheduled for the following month, and the atmosphere was different this time. Word had spread about the email, about Victoria's plan to sell the land, and even some of her most loyal supporters had started to distance themselves. The morning of the hearing felt like the entire town was holding its breath. I arrived at the community center an hour early, and there were already people lined up outside waiting for the doors to open. By the time the proceedings were scheduled to start, over 220 people had packed into the room with another 60 standing outside trying to hear through the windows. Local TV crews had set up cameras in the back, and I spotted reporters from 3 different newspapers taking notes before anything had even begun. Judge Patterson entered at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, and the room fell silent so quickly it was almost eerie. He was in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that had probably sentenced 1,000 criminals without flinching. He sat down, arranged some papers on the bench, and looked out at the crowd with an expression that said he was not going to tolerate any nonsense. His opening statement was brief and direct. This hearing was about land rights, contract law, and community governance. He would review evidence, hear testimony, and make determinations based on facts and law, not emotion or politics. Anyone who disrupted the proceedings would be removed. Then he turned to Victoria's attorney and invited him to present the HOA's defense. The lawyer was young and looked nervous, probably because he knew exactly how bad his client's position was. He argued that the HOA had operated for 40 years, that residents had made their homes on this land with reasonable expectation of stability, and that I was trying to destroy a community for personal profit. When it was our turn, Marcus stood up with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the winning cards. He started with the basics, displaying the original lease agreement on the projector so everyone in the room could read it. He highlighted the key clauses about residential use only, no commercial activity, and respect for original residents. Then he systematically walked through every single violation. First came the community center evidence, photographs of the building with banners, advertising wedding rentals at $2,000 per event, corporate retreat packages, and private party bookings. Marcus showed receipts proving the HOA had generated over $320,000 in rental income over the past 6 years. He displayed the business registration for the rental operation, which listed Victoria as the principal officer. Judge Patterson's face remained unreadable throughout Marcus's presentation, but I saw him making notes. Next came the management company evidence. Marcus projected a spreadsheet showing every fee collected by the management company. $500 per household per month times 33 households times 72 months. $1,188,000 in total revenue. Then he showed where that money had gone. Victoria had paid herself $425,000 in management fees over 6 years, plus another $110,000 through her brother's fake job, plus consulting fees to shell companies she controlled. She'd used HOA money to pay for her car, her country club membership, and vacations she'd labeled as professional development conferences. I heard several people in the audience gasp out loud. The judge looked up from the spreadsheet and asked Victoria's attorney if his client could explain these payments. The lawyer stammered something about legitimate compensation for services rendered, but even he didn't sound convinced. At one point, Judge Patterson interrupted Marcus's presentation and said, "Counselor, are you suggesting that 40 years of established residency should be voided over management fee technicalities?" My heart sank. This wasn't going to be as easy as I'd thought. Marcus didn't miss a beat. He said, "Your Honor, with respect, we're not talking about technicalities. We're talking about a systematic scheme to profit from and ultimately steal this property. If I may direct the court's attention to Exhibit 47, that's when he pulled up Victoria's email to the developer on the projector. The room went dead silent as people read the words on the screen. The clinical language about land acquisition strategy, the $16 million valuation, the 12% finder's fee, the assessment that I appeared to have limited knowledge of property law complexities. Judge Patterson read the email twice, and when he looked up, his expression had changed. He asked Victoria's attorney if his client could explain the email. The lawyer requested permission to consult with Victoria, and the judge granted a brief recess. When we reconvened, Victoria took the stand. She tried to maintain her composure, explaining that she'd simply been exploring options for the community's long-term security, that the email was taken out of context, that she'd never actually intended to pursue the land sale. But as Marcus questioned her, her story fell apart. He walked her through the timeline of harassment against Evelyn and other residents, showing how the campaign had intensified right around the time she'd started corresponding with the developer. He showed her budget documents where she'd allocated HOA funds for legal fees related to adverse possession claims. Every answer she gave just dug the hole deeper. Then Marcus moved to the victim testimony phase. He called Evelyn to the stand first, and watching that 82-year-old woman stand up and walk to the microphone with her head held high was one of the most powerful things I'd ever seen. Evelyn's testimony was quiet but devastating. She described 42 years in her home, raising her children, burying her husband, maintaining her garden with loving care. Then she described the fines, the threats, the fear that had consumed the last decade of her life. When Evelyn finished, 2 other families gave their testimony, each story adding another layer to the portrait of systematic abuse. The family that had been forced to remove their solar panels talked about watching their children's college fund disappear into HOA fines. The couple that had been banned from keeping backyard chickens talked about teaching their kids about sustainability and having that dream crushed by arbitrary rules. By the time the testimony phase ended, even some of Victoria's supporters looked shaken. Victoria's attorney made one last attempt to salvage the case, but his heart clearly wasn't in it anymore. Judge Patterson called a 15-minute recess, and when he returned, his expression was carved from granite. He said he had reviewed the evidence, heard the testimony, and examined all arguments presented by both sides. The lease agreement between my family and the HOA was valid and binding. The terms were clear and unambiguous. The evidence showed systematic and willful breach of those terms. The establishment and operation of a commercial management company constituted commercial activity prohibited under the lease. The harassment and targeting of original residents violated the Respect Clause. The unauthorized construction and environmental damage breached the land use provisions. The email correspondence demonstrated that the good faith defense was without merit and that there had been, in fact, a deliberate plan to claim the property through adverse possession. Then he delivered the ruling. The lease was terminated effective immediately. The organization would have 90 days to dissolve, transfer any legitimate community functions to a new voluntary association, and cease all operations. All outstanding fines levied by the HOA were declared void and unenforceable. Any liens placed on properties were dissolved immediately. The HOA was prohibited from collecting any fees or dues during the dissolution period. Most significantly, Judge Patterson issued a personal injunction against Victoria, barring her from any contact with the victims who testified and from serving in any capacity on any homeowners association board in the state. The injunction was permanent. But the judge wasn't finished. He said that the evidence presented suggested potential criminal activity that went beyond the scope of this civil proceeding, and he was therefore referring the matter to the district attorney for investigation into possible charges including embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud. Victoria's face had gone white. Her lawyer immediately requested a recess to consult with his client, and the judge granted it. But everyone in that room knew what it meant. Victoria wasn't just losing a civil case. She was looking at potential prison time. Judge Patterson said he would issue a written ruling within 30 days covering the civil damages portion of the case, and that the criminal referral would be processed through the appropriate channels. Those 30 days felt like 30 years. The criminal investigation moved faster than I expected. The district attorney's office issued a statement within a week saying they were opening a formal investigation. Dozens of residents came forward with additional testimony. 3 months after the hearing, the grand jury returned indictments. Victoria was charged with embezzlement and wire fraud. 2 of her board members who'd been complicit were charged with misdemeanors and offered plea deals in exchange for testimony. 4 months after the indictments, Victoria's legal team approached the DA with a plea offer. She pleaded guilty to embezzlement and wire fraud in exchange for the prosecution recommending a specific sentence. The sentencing hearing, 2 weeks later, was packed with victims and community members. Victoria looked diminished, wearing a plain gray suit, and she wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. The prosecutor laid out the facts methodically, emphasizing the vulnerability of the victims, the systematic nature of the abuse, and the amount of money involved. Then the victims were allowed to give impact statements. Evelyn spoke last, and her words were simple and devastating. I'm 82 years old, and I spent 11 years of my life afraid of losing my home. Victoria Blackwell stole those years from me, and she did it for money she didn't need and power she didn't deserve. I can never get those years back, but I can make sure she understands what she took from me and everyone else in this community. Judge Patterson listened without interruption, and when it was time for sentencing, His expression was grave. He sentenced Victoria to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She would be required to pay $425,000 in restitution. She would perform 2,000 hours of community service after her release, and she was permanently banned from serving on any HOA board or in any position of fiduciary responsibility. Victoria's face crumpled as the judge spoke, and she had to be supported by her lawyer as she was led out of the courtroom. I felt Evelyn's hand squeeze mine, and when I looked over at her, she was crying quietly, tears of relief rather than pain. Judge Patterson's written ruling on the civil damages came the same week. He awarded me $800,000 in back rent for unauthorized use of the land. He awarded an additional $135,000 for survey costs, legal fees, and damages related to the harassment campaign and arson attempt. Punitive damages added another $550,000. But more importantly, he awarded damages to the victims through the class action settlement Marcus had structured. Evelyn received $160,000. The family with the solar panels got $95,000. The couple with the chickens received $48,000. 10 other families who'd been systematically targeted received a combined $410,000. The total victim compensation was over $900,000, to be paid from the HOA's reserve fund first, then from Victoria's personal assets, then from insurance policies. Evelyn used her settlement money to pay off her house completely and set up a scholarship fund for local kids interested in environmental studies. The other victims used their money to rebuild their lives and invest in the futures Victoria had tried to steal from them. The old HOA was officially dissolved 3 months after sentencing, and something new took its place. The residents formed what they called the Greenfield Community Association. No mandatory fees. No fines. No threats. Membership was completely voluntary, and decisions were made through consensus. The new association focused on organizing community events, maintaining shared spaces through volunteer work, and supporting neighbors who needed help. It was everything an HOA should have been from the beginning. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, I stood with Evelyn at the dedication ceremony for the Patricia Reed Memorial Park on a perfect autumn morning. 520 people gathered in the meadow. We'd worked with environmental consultants and landscape architects to create 620 acres of public conservation area with 16 miles of hiking trails, community garden plots, picnic areas, and a wildlife preserve. Evelyn cut the ribbon with hands that shook only slightly, and when the crowd applauded, I saw tears streaming down her face. She turned to me and said, "I spent 11 years in fear. Now I get to spend however many years I have left in joy. That's what you gave all of us." Her transformation was mirrored throughout the community. She started the Community Elders Garden Club, teaching kids about sustainable gardening every Saturday morning. The family with the solar panels launched a renewable energy education program. The couple with chickens expanded to 14 birds and started a farm-to-table cooperative supplying 55 families. As for me, I quit my job in the city, converted Patricia's cabin into a permanent home, and started working remotely while managing the land full-time. Somewhere during the fight, I'd discovered I was good at this. Not just the legal strategy, but the deeper work of bringing people together and creating spaces where communities could flourish. Marcus and I walk these trails every weekend now, planning the next phase. Some partnerships start in battle and grow into something more. Patricia hadn't just left me land. She'd left me purpose, community, and a future I'd never imagined but couldn't imagine living without. A year ago, this place had been a battleground. Now it was a sanctuary, Victoria had tried to build walls and control every aspect of life here, and she destroyed herself in the process. Patricia had taught me to open gates instead, to trust people to do the right thing when given the chance, and to understand that real strength came from service rather than domination. What do you think about my case? Leave a comment and let me know how you would have handled this situation. Some people build walls to keep others out. We tore down those walls and discovered that what remained was something far more valuable, a community that belonged to everyone. A place where people could breathe freely and live without fear. That made all the difference.